At some point during your Spanish language learning, you'll come to find out that there are two main verb tenses that you will need very frequently in Spanish when referring to the past. Now, these have all kinds of different names, but very typically in English, you will commonly hear them referred to as the preterite and the imperfect. Now, for the sake of simplicity in this video, we're not going to talk about other ways in which we could talk about the past that would require the use of auxiliary verbs, compound tenses like I have eaten or I had gone. No, we're only going to be talking about those simple past tenses of the preterite and the imperfect. So we're always going to start with context. And one of our most recent stories on the channel that has been redone into a video called Dos Hermanos is written from the point of view of a brother thinking back to the past. So naturally, we have a good mix of both of these types of past tenses in that story. So I want to just take a look and extract some juicy points about the preterite and the imperfect. And since I did just do a video about the imperfect, we're going to start talking mainly about the preterite, but then at the end of the video, we'll do a comparison and we'll have some exercises so that you can see the difference. If you have not yet seen the story Dos Hermanos, well, go check that out right after this video. And also, if you would like the slides to go along with today's presentation, as well as the transcripts and translations for all of the stories that I currently have on this channel, well, just follow the link below in the description box so that you can access my free resource library where I have all of that published for you. But for now, without further ado, comencemos, amigos. All right, guys, so in this lesson, we're going to learn the main uses of the preterite tense, and we'll see some examples from the story Dos Hermanos. We'll notice how to form the preterite tense, at least for the regular verbs, and we'll compare and contrast the preterite with the imperfect tense, using a timeline and some practice exercises so that you guys can kind of get a feel for the difference there of those two past tenses. Now, when do we use the preterite tense? Well, we use it to describe actions that have been completed that had a specific start and end time. Let's look at an example from the story.
¿Qué sacaste? Le pregunté. Saqué 9.5, dijo con una pequeña sonrisa.
So, just for some context, if you recall from the story, here we have a scene where there are two brothers who have taken an exam. And one asks, what did you get? And the other one says, I got a 9.5, which, by the way, is kind of the equivalent of like a 95%. We would tend to use that type of grading scale in the States. So this is an event that it happened, it's over, the test is done, and it's what did you get? We're going to use the preterite in this type of circumstance. Another circumstance in which we use the preterite is to talk about the beginning or the end of an event. Here is another example from the story.
Pero durante ese primer año de la preparatoria, los alumnos mismos empezaron a hacer comparaciones.
Pero durante ese primer año de la preparatoria, los alumnos mismos empezaron a hacer comparaciones. So during that first year of high school, this is what started to happen. Los alumnos empezaron a hacer comparaciones. So we're saying that this is when this event started and we're using the preterite. Now again, don't worry right now about how to form it or anything like that. Just get a feel for when we use this type of past tense. We also use the preterite to refer to actions that happened at a specific time or date. So here are some examples. This is not actually something that we have in the story, but this is an example to give you an idea. La semana pasada, mi padre me llamó a su oficina y expresó su preocupación. So last week, my father called me in to his office and expressed his concern. So we have this trigger phrase here, la semana pasada, last week. When you see phrases that are specifying times in the past, last week, yesterday, last month, last year, on March 13th, 2021, this is what happened. Those kinds of trigger phrases, usually we're going to be using the preterite to go along with that. Here's another example. Pasé 3 años en la academia. So I spent 3 years at the academy. Here we are specifying the time frame. So this is another kind of trigger phrase that will help you know that you need to use the preterite in this circumstance. Another situation in which we use the preterite tense is to pair it with the imperfect to state an interrupted action. Here's an example of that from the story.
Pero mientras nos acercábamos a la casa, volví a recordar y me puse nervioso.
Pero mientras nos acercábamos a la casa, volví a recordar y me puse nervioso. So we started out with the imperfect tense. As we got closer to home, we're describing an event that's taking place. It's still going on. So we're using the imperfect tense there with the acercábamos. But then all of a sudden this is interrupted. It says, I again remembered and became nervous. So we interrupt that imperfect tense thought to tell you that this is what happened in this specific moment. Volví a recordar y me puse nervioso. We're talking about a specific event that took place at a specific time. Let's see another example.
Mientras yo aún seguía en la preparatoria, José entró a una universidad para estudiar ingeniería.
Mientras yo aún seguía en la preparatoria, José entró a una universidad para estudiar ingeniería. So while I was still in high school, this is the imperfect, this is a long-term event, but we're going to interrupt this thought. Because while I was still in high school, José entered a university. That was a one-time thing, he entered. And so we interrupt this thought and come in with the preterite. This highlighted verb entró is in the preterite tense. And finally, we use the preterite tense often to state events in a sequence. Not always, but this is another common use of the preterite tense. For example, mi maestra me miró fijamente, suspiró y comenzó a hablar. This sentence is not actually in the story, but it easily could have been. So my teacher stared at me, sighed, and started to speak. This is all preterite. We're describing these events as they took place in a series, and you'll often notice that in these cases we use the preterite. All right, how do we form the preterite tense? You've seen some examples already, so you may have already started to notice a few things. That's always what I want you to do first, just start to notice before we come in with any sort of conjugation table or any sort of explanation. And I want you to understand that never am I expecting you to memorize a conjugation table. That is not how I learned Spanish at all. The only purpose of me showing you a conjugation table or giving you an explanation is so that you can just start to continue to notice as you're consuming Spanish via your listening and your reading. So here we see how to form the preterite tense. We have the subjects over here to the left, and we have these 3 example verbs so that you can see how the AR verbs conjugate. And then fortunately, the ER and the IR verbs actually conjugate the same way. So the verbs ending in AR have their specific conjugation endings, and the ER and IR have their specific endings, and those are the same. So here are just a few things to start to notice. In the yo, I, and the él, ella, and usted, so he, she, you, formal, all of those verbs have an accent mark on the last vowel. Are you seeing that e with an accent in caminé? Are you seeing the I with an accent mark on volví, escribí? Those are in the yo form. And then with the él, ella, usted, we have the o. In all of those forms, we have caminó, volvió, escribió. Accent mark. So when you are talking about the past and you see a verb that has one of these vowels on the end with an accent mark, that is going to be an alert for you that we're dealing with the preterite tense here. There's another reason why it's important to note that accent mark, because when we don't include it, oftentimes we change the meaning of what we're saying. Take this example sentence that we saw earlier. La semana pasada mi padre me llamó a su oficina y expresó su preocupación. So, again, that llamó is he called. Okay, he called. But what if we forgot that accent mark? What will we actually technically be saying? Me llamo. I'm sure you're familiar with that phrase. My name is, right? Me llamo, and then your name. Completely different word. It is from the same verb llamar. So you're saying I am called, but we see that all of a sudden we took it back to present tense because we didn't have that accent mark on there. And what about expreso? So this is he expressed, and we know that because it has that accent mark. What if we don't put it on? We have expreso. So I express. Again, not only did we change the tense, we're in present tense, but also the person changed. Now I'm saying I express. Here's another interesting thing that we could notice. So when we're talking about nosotros or nosotras, the endings for the regular AR and IR verbs are the same in both the preterite and the present tenses. How are you going to be able to tell the difference both when you are consuming Spanish and as well as when you are speaking? Well, it's just going to depend on the context. The context is going to give you a clue. So here are some example sentences using the verb caminamos. We walk. Ese día, mi hermano y yo caminamos a casa. So that day, my brother and I walked home. Even though it can be walk or walked, it has to be walked in this sentence, right? Because we said ese día, that day. Look at that second sentence. Mi hermano y yo siempre caminamos a casa. So you might say, well, technically, my brother and I always walked home, or my brother and I always walk home would be correct, and it would be in English. The only thing you have to keep in mind here is that when we're using always, something that habitually happened, we're not going to be using the preterite tense at all. So if I were referring to the past in that second sentence, I would have said, mi hermano y yo siempre caminábamos a casa. So knowing that, we know that we are indeed speaking about present tense in this second sentence. My brother and I always walk home. Now, so far we've been talking about verbs that are regular verbs in the preterite tense, but there are a lot of verbs that are irregular in the preterite tense, so I want you to keep this in mind. If you saw my video about the imperfect tense, that wasn't the case. We in fact only have 3 verbs that conjugate differently in the imperfect tense, but in the preterite there are many. So it's not something to stress about, but it's a reason to continue your input and continue to just notice these things so that you naturally learn how to conjugate these verbs, even though you're not going to have a regular verb conjugation table to help you out with it. Here's just one of the examples from the story. The verb sacar is an irregular verb in the preterite tense. So if we're going to say yo saqué, so I got, I got 9.5, said Jose happily. So you can see that we have a Q in here, we have a U. This verb didn't conjugate in the way that we would expect if we were going by that chart that we just saw. Here's another example, poner. Poner typically means to put, but here in this example sentence, we actually have a set phrase, which is ponerse nervioso, and that means to get nervous, actually. So as it's conjugated here in the story, it's me puse nervioso. So the only thing that I want you to see is the puse. That did not conjugate as we would expect. If we were looking at that conjugation table, we would expect it to be poni, wouldn't we? If we were looking at the ER column and looking at the yo, but it's not poni, even though my 3-year-old used to sometimes say that, which was really cute. Here's another fun and actually very helpful fact that we could be grateful for. Both ser and ir, very popular verbs, right? To be and to go, they conjugate the exact same way in the preterite tense. So even though they are very irregular, as you can see here, their conjugations look nothing like the infinitive form of the verb, but they're actually the same. So yo fui is I went, and yo fui is also I was. Tú fuiste, you went. Tú fuiste, you were. And so on and so forth. Very, very interesting fun fact here. I want to show you this timeline before we get into our practice exercises to compare the preterite and the imperfect. I just want to show you this timeline for those of you who are visual like me and really need to see things like this. So as far as the preterite is concerned, which we've been emphasizing in this video, if we were to look at a timeline and we're looking at the past, because both of these are past tenses, the preterite tense would be one dot on the timeline, one event in history. Maybe someone says, ¿Dónde estudiaste? Where did you study? And you say, estudié en la Universidad de Princeton. You're just talking about that's where you studied. It's over and it's done. You don't study there anymore. What about the imperfect? What if you said, estudiaba en la Universidad de Princeton? This is a correct sentence as well, but the meaning is different. This means I was studying at Princeton University. So maybe you're going to say, I was studying at Princeton University when I had this brilliant idea, right? You're probably in the middle of continuing to describe something if you're using the imperfect here. And if you look at the timeline, this is more continuous, isn't it? This is not just one little dot. So I was studying at Princeton University, or it can also mean I used to study at Princeton University. So maybe you wanted to say, estudiaba en la Universidad de Princeton, pero ahora estudio en Harvard, ¿verdad? So I used to study at Princeton University, but I now study at Harvard. So imperfect, we're usually saying you were doing something, used to do something, whereas the preterite is one specific event in history. So keep this difference in mind as we practice distinguishing between the two past tenses. So the only thing that I want you to focus on in these examples isn't so much the formation of the verbs. I want you to let the context guide you. My brother and I were taking private math classes over the summer. Were. My brother and I were taking private math classes over the summer. Are we going to use preterite or imperfect here? What do you think?
Mi hermano y yo estábamos tomando clases de matemáticas particulares durante el verano.
Well, this is going to be the imperfect because we're describing something that was happening over a period of time. It's over the whole summer that we were taking private math classes. Mi hermano y yo estábamos tomando clases de matemáticas particulares durante el verano. If you saw my video about the imperfect tense, then you'll recognize that habamos for the imperfect. When I marked your brother's exam, I thought you would do just as well, Marco. So the teacher says, when I marked that exam, this is what I thought. Preterite or imperfect?
Cuando corregí el examen de tu hermano, pensé que tú saldrías igual de bien, Marco.
This is the preterite. Cuando corregí el examen de tu hermano, pensé que tú saldrías igual de bien, Marco. So we have those typical accent marks, corregí, pensé. Remember that we'll typically see that in the preterite tense. And why is it preterite? Well, the teacher marked the exam. It's an event that's over and done. This is what she thought in that moment. We're using the preterite. What did you get? I asked him. I got a 9.5, he said with a little smile. We've actually already touched on this one. Do you remember? Preterite or imperfect?
¿Qué sacaste? Le pregunté. Saqué 9.5, dijo con una pequeña sonrisa.
This is the preterite. ¿Qué sacaste? Le pregunté. Saqué 9.5. Dijo con una pequeña sonrisa. Here's another one. And all of our highlighted verbs here are in the same tense. So see if you can pick up on it. So think, are we talking about one event or are we describing things that typically would happen?
Aunque José y yo sabíamos de las comparaciones, ninguno decía nada, o al menos no demasiado. José sabía que cualquier intento de consolarme solo me iba a hacer sentir peor. Y yo tampoco quería que se sintiera mal tan solo porque yo no podía seguirle el paso.
Preterite or imperfect? This is the imperfect. This is ongoing, right? Are you starting to get a sense of the difference? He always listened to my songs and always encouraged me to continue. Preterite or imperfect? Hint, we have a trigger word here that appears twice that actually indicates which one we should use.
Él siempre escuchaba mis canciones y siempre me animaba a continuar.
This is the imperfect. Él siempre, always, escuchaba mis canciones y siempre, always, me animaba a continuar. That always indicates already that this is a continuous event. We automatically know we have to use the imperfect. All right? Afterward, I received a scholarship to study in New York. I received a scholarship. Preterite or imperfect? One-time event or continuous?
Posteriormente, recibí una beca para estudiar en Nueva York.
Preterite. Posteriormente recibí una beca para estudiar en Nueva York. Recibí. That typical I with accent mark on the end. This is a one-time thing. Very nice job, guys. That's going to be all for today. Remember, if you would like a copy of the slides that I used for today's presentation, then simply enter your email address at the link below in the description box and let me know where to send your password to access my free resource library. This is an ever-growing library of resources, so definitely check that out. Thank you, as always, for spending a little bit of time with me today. I am always grateful. And until next time, don't forget to go out and live your new language today. Bye-bye.